So one thing I love about the Episcopal order of service is that the living water of our story is woven throughout the service. It's not just constrained to the sermon or even to the hymns, delightful as they are, but the story is woven through. So if you look at the Kyrie that we sang, and if you look at the psalm here, and you look at the different readings, and even especially the reading from Paul's letter to the Romans, it talks about grace. And I'm going to touch on all of these themes, but what I love is that the entire service is the message. It's not just what I'm saying. So I just found that was really interesting to contemplate as we went through the beginning of the service, and of course the service continues after I speak. And these are different ways of encountering Jesus. The song, the readings, even the peace, that's encountering God in each other. So this is the third Sunday of Lent, and throughout Lent we encounter Jesus in different ways that people experience the Christ. And last week we heard the story of Nicodemus, a member of the Sanhedrin, a Pharisee, a man, a powerful leader in the Jewish community at that time. And this week we'll hear about a different encounter. But last week's encounter that Dennis spoke about was a meeting that happened at night and was initiated by Nicodemus himself. And as he questioned Jesus, he was very cautious. There was a few misunderstandings. And by the end of the story, we aren't actually sure if Nicodemus bought the whole story, right? He's kind of still on the fence. So in contrast to the Nicodemus story from last week, here's the details of the story this week that Tracy just read to us. This is in a public place in broad daylight at noon. And, it's at a public well. It's not in somebody's back garden. It's in a public place. This is with a woman who essentially has no power in that community. She's a Samaritan from an outlying group who isn't welcomed by the Pharisees or from anyone who follows traditional Jewish law. So this is not a person with great power. And in contrast to Nicodemus, who was a strict follower of the law, and yet this woman, as we find out in the text, isn't even married to the person she's living with, which was a violation of the law at that time. And the contrast is pretty distinct. So we're encountering Jesus in a very different mode. And Jesus is in fact the one who asks her for a drink instead of the other way around. So here's another moment of Jesus reminding us that he's human. He's thirsty. It's hot. He needs a drink. Ironically, we never find out if he got that drink. So they have this whole philosophical discussion. Maybe at the end of it, Jesus is like, geez, could someone just get me a drink? But he asks for water, right? And also, the phrase he uses, living water, we find it, philosophical and spiritual, but it actually had two different meanings in Greek. And there's a standard meaning, which just meant that it was flowing water, like from a spring or from a moving water source. It wasn't stagnant. So it could just be, he says, hey, could you give me some water from the spring? And the woman didn't think much of it. Of course, Jesus, as he has a way of doing, took something simple and complicated it, right? He took words and made us rethink them. So now we think of living water as having a spiritual connotation. And it probably didn't until that moment when Jesus started building on that phrase and telling us, what is water really? It's almost kind of a Socrates moment when he's asking people questions and unpacking it. So before we get into water itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about Samaritans. We had the story of the Good Samaritan earlier this year, and that's a classic story. We've heard the term Samaritan for a long time. Just so you all know, Samaritans are still around. They're still a thing. They're a real people. They aren't just a biblical legend. So let's actually back up to the kind of the founding of monotheistic religion, and I'll keep this short. But thousands of years ago, a particular tribe found themselves with one particular approach to the divine. And this tribe was surrounded by other tribes who worshiped many different gods. And among these tribes, human sacrifice was endemic. In fact, babies were even sacrificed to the god Moloch. People covered themselves in self-flagellation and then covered themselves in tattoos as a way of identifying with a particular god. Slavery and human destruction was everywhere. And so a tribesman named Abraham received a revelation and was told, even though he had a knife in his hand, not to sacrifice his child, and instead to rely upon a God of abundance and grace. This is a pretty radical intervention in human history. And all monotheistic religions, from Judaism to Islam to Christianity, trace their origin point back to that moment of intervention in Abraham's life. All the Abrahamic religions derive from that moment. And the Samaritan religion traces itself back to Abraham as well. So Abraham's children were descendants were the ones who went off to Egypt, and you've heard the stories of Moses and of Joseph with the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? So these are all descendants of Abraham. And in Egypt, God saved Abraham's descendants from the angel of death with the famous plagues. So the descendants of Abraham then became known as the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm taking a long story and making it very short, but became the 12 tribes of Israel and then founded the kingdom, historically based in Jerusalem, known as Israel, that covered all of present-day Palestine. And all Islamic people also claim religious heritage in Abraham's act of mercy. So King David was one of Abraham's descendants, and Jesus was an heir of David, right? So it all ties together. And yet the kingdom of Israel was attacked and invaded at various points in history. And so during one of these invasions, this is where the story of the Samaritans comes about. So you have tribes that are invaded and attacked by foreign usurpers. And during one of these invasions, some of the northern Israelite tribes were not deported. They kind of snuck into the hills and stayed behind. So this is where the Samaritans draw their heritage. Now, whether that's actually factual or not, who knows? But there are lots of questions about where they came from, but there's actually been genetic analysis that they do derive from the same exact genetic stock as people who historically are Jewish people from that region. So, but what's interesting is that the Samaritans have a version of religion that's just slightly different from common Judaism that we know today. Their Torah is just the Torah, not other books that Judaism embraces as part of the whole history of Scripture for them. And they have a slightly different mountain that they worship on. They worship on Mount Gerizim because they believe that was the mountain where Abraham did not sacrifice his son. Okay, so in this text, when Jesus says, neither on the mountain or in Jerusalem, he's referring to that difference. Because the Jewish people believe that Jerusalem and the place that Israelis now call the Temple Mount is the holy place. And Samaritans believe that Mount Gerizim is the holy place. And so very, very similar religions, but just different enough that they don't agree. And if you're converting from Judaism to Samaritanism or back and forth, you have to be reconverted. You have to be not baptized, but you have to go through a whole process. So there remains a lot of prejudice today between Samaritan people and Jewish people. And there aren't very many Samaritans left, but they're still a thing. They are really a distinct ethnic and religious group. So let's talk about how people see each other for a minute. And I thought of, as I was writing this, I thought of a science fiction novel by a guy named China Miéville called The City and the City. It's also I think an HBO show. But The City and the City, because it's written by a science fiction writer, describes two groups of people. Let's imagine the side that Barbara's on over here. Here, wave your hand, Barbara. Okay, there's Barbara's side, and over here, here's Karen's side. So imagine that you were actually in two different dimensions and yet lived in the same physical space. So as you walked past each other, you didn't touch. And that these dimensions, so you would have separate entrances, separate airports, separate ways of being, right? So you're reading this book and you're like, wow, imagine that dimensions are collided, and that would be so fascinating. Like, how would that happen, right? Overlapping multiverses or something, right? So you're reading this along, and then gradually, as you read the book, you start to understand, spoiler alert, sorry, gonna give it away, that this separation between Karen's side and Barbara's side is in their heads. That this separation is only in the eyes of the people. And if a ball bounces from Karen to Barbara, it's actually physically bouncing. It doesn't bounce off the dimension. That separation is entirely in the eyes of the people, in their own heads. And this happens with us all too often as human beings, right? Just as Jewish people at that time did not recognize the existence of Samaritan people as valid human beings, and Sunni and Shia often don't recognize each other. And in India, the Dalit caste is known as untouchable and invisible by other castes. We too in America, even though we pride ourselves in our democracy, our egalitarianism, we have this same way of ignoring people who might be on the other side of the fence. Father Dennis and I had the privilege this week of being part of the Family Promise Ministry that Kaz has been so instrumental in setting up for St. David's to participate in this ministry that has families who are houseless and are seeking transition to permanent housing where they have a safe place to stay, right? And so we stayed overnight with some families who were houseless, and it brought to mind some of the conversations I've had with people who are houseless, that the worst part of being on the street is that you are not seen. People won't meet your eyes. You don't really exist. So that shared humanity isn't there for those people. They have a sense that they are untouchable. And we all, I think, have experienced that from our side of privilege. You know, people who do drugs, who are obviously marked by drug use, or people who have been imprisoned, or are dirty, or houseless, or mentally ill. Those people are, in our society, to be ignored or to be looked over. And they are powerless to have their stories heard. Well, so let's go back to that passage and understand what's happening with Jesus in a similar situation. He shows up at this well. There is a Samaritan woman there in broad daylight who is, in his society, as a male rabbi, untouchable. Not somebody he should be paying attention to. Not somebody he should even see. And he doesn't demand anything from her. He just asks, hey, could you give me a hand? He acknowledges their shared needs, their shared humanity, and he reaches out to her in broad daylight. This is why his disciples are surprised. Like, dude, like, she's a woman, she's a Samaritan. Now you're asking about her private life? Whoa. So there are three movements here in this passage. The first is about water. He asks for this water. The second is this conversation about the private life, and that's another boundary crossing, because men were not supposed to know about the private lives of women. I think today this would be a little rude, right? And yet Jesus sees her. He communicates to her exactly what her life is about, and he does so in a way that doesn't really cast judgment, but just states the truth. He sees her fully in her story. And then the third movement of this passage is a conversation about truth and spirit and living water, where he takes that need that we have and turns it into something deeper. And in her words, she harkens back to that passage from Exodus that we read. She's standing at the water source and she says, is God among us or not? Is God among us? And then she also asks, well, you're a prophet. Tell me who's right. The Jews or the Samaritans, right? Because this is a common question. And he kind of says, wrong question. He says, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain here, the holy mountain for Samaritans, nor in Jerusalem, sorry, Karen's side, but neither one will really matter. Neither place appointed by human beings is essential. These artificial differences is not what is at the core of God's relationship with humankind. So Jesus crosses these boundaries, and the metaphor he uses is water. And he talks about water giving you so much more than she expects, right? And I think what he's really talking about is what is mentioned in that passage from Romans. He's talking about grace and God's grace. So let's talk about grace a little bit. In the sermon last week, Dennis said, we are not granted salvation based on what we know. We are instead granted salvation through the unearned grace of God. So sometimes we toss words like mercy and grace around easily without understanding that these have deep theological import. There's actually a radical difference between Christianity and most other religions. Some time ago, Bono of U2 was asked about how he approaches karmic payback and what he thinks of karma. And he said, I don't believe in karma. I believe in grace. So I might be showing my age as a 50-year-old white guy to quote U2. But he was onto something. Christians don't believe in karma. We don't believe you can earn your way to heaven or that anyone actually deserves salvation more than somebody else. You can't work your way up. There's nothing you can do to be more holy. Because Christianity is the ultimate egalitarian religion. Anyone can be loved by God and is loved by God, even a murderer or a torturer or mentally ill or somebody who claims to be holy. You're on a level playing field with God. God's grace is given abundantly, like water that washes over us. That's also what we have in baptism. The water washes over us, and it is the grace of God coming through us. It is unearned. And it is a forgiveness and a redemption that comes to us in our uncertainty, in our doubt, like Nicodemus, or maybe in our untouchability, like this Samaritan woman, in ways that we might not fit a cultural norm or might consider ourselves to be living in a different world. Jesus comes to us. He sees us, welcomes us, loves us, asks us to share this living water with each other. Thanks be to God.